Hey, good morning, everyone. It's John. I don't know if the lighting is messed up or not. Turn this light. Hope all's well. I don't have a lot to go over today. I just want to go over a few things. Obviously, I just want to reiterate um, some of the things that we've been going over the last few weeks. This discussion question from last week. Not really. It's not really my favorite discussion question in the class. I don't really think it has much to do with healthcare law itself. It's an employment law issue with respect to discrimination. The same rules would apply with respect to a hospital as they would with any other employer, really. So it's not really a healthcare issue, but it's good to see. I think that so many different issues it can come into play in the healthcare setting. And I had when I was a young associate with my first law firm, I had the head of our healthcare practice group taught healthcare law at a local law school, and the first day of class he would go in and just kind of ask the students what they were interested in terms of practicing law, and he would write it all on the board, and the point was you get all kinds of different things, but his point was that you can find all that in healthcare law, and it's very true. In the however many years I've been doing this, I have found that you're really dealing with a wide range of issues in the healthcare setting, and many of you work in the healthcare setting and realize that you probably go in to work each day not really knowing what to expect. So you just never know. But anyways, it's a good question in terms of that, and a lot of the discussion posts, the letters were very well written. I've considered in the past dividing up the class. Half of the people write the letter on behalf of the hospital, and half the people in the class write a letter on behalf of the employee. That way, you make sure that you get what am I trying to say here? Letters for both sides of the coin, but most people tend to write letters on behalf of the employee because the facts are more sympathetic to the employee. Well, one thing we need to understand is that sometimes we face issues and we have to advocate for the non-sympathetic figure in a case, and so I certainly do that quite a bit. So before we move on to week 6 material, just again want to emphasize, as we're really heading into, we're setting aside the legal issue component of the class for, well, at least momentarily, and we're picking up the ethics side, at least for the next couple of weeks. However, the whole process of methodology of analysis is very similar. We've talked a lot about the IRAC method of analysis, and it's very important. With the assignment this past week, last week's assignment that I already graded, you're asked to kind of analyze the elements of that particular negligence claim, and just it's important to remember that each element of the claim needs to be analyzed separately. So you have to go through each element of that claim and run it through that IRAC analysis process to determine whether or not that element exists or can be proven by a preponderance of the evidence just based on the facts that you were given. Very similar to when I was a sophomore in college, I had a physics professor that always talked about different formulas that we were learning in physics, and I was terrible at science and terrible at math. But one thing he always talked about was, you're given all these formulas in physics, and then you're given numbers, and so he'd always just preach, plug in the numbers into the formula, turn the crank, and out comes your conclusion. And legal analysis is very similar. It's not mathematical by any means. There's no unequivocal right or wrong answer, but it's very similar in process and methodology in that you have a rule. In the case of a malpractice case, you have 4 elements to that rule that you have to show: duty, breach of duty or standard of care, causation, and damages. So you have those 4 things you need to look at and analyze. So, and then you have your facts. Your facts would be like the numbers in a physics formula. So you have your facts, you plug in the facts to the rule, apply those facts to the rule, analyze it, and then you come out with your conclusion. So you just kind of very similar to the physics concept or any mathematical concept. You have a rule, plug in the facts, turn the crank, and you have your conclusion. So that whole process is the analysis piece that's so important. And really, if you get nothing more out of this class, my hope is that you take away this idea of analyzing issues and thinking critically about them. Perfect example is that discussion question we had on the HIPAA issue, on the privacy issue. I mean, it's very easy to say, well, based on the facts, it's clearly a breach, or it's clearly not a breach. Well, I mean, there's no way to really know that unless you understand what the term breach means. And once you understand what the rule is, then you've got your facts, take into consideration the factors, take into consideration any exceptions. I mean, it's all part of the rule. And then do that analysis, turn the crank, and come out with your conclusion. And this legal component piece of this milestone project is going to be very similar to that. So if you have any questions about that, I've offered many times, just please feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to answer questions or talk through anything if you're confused by any of it. So this week we're kind of diving into, this week and next week, we're really diving into the ethics piece. We touched on that briefly in the first week or two. You may recall that I think it was maybe one of the first assignments that we did was discuss that scenario with respect to limited flu vaccines and how you would look at that or approach that through a variety of different ethical theories and principles. So we're kind of diving back into that again. 2 things, just generally talking about ethics, and then we'll talk about clinical trials a little bit, just something that is in your reading for this week. When I think about ethical issues and ethics, I divide it up into 2 different pieces. First, there's the kind of the collective societal piece, where we as a society have collectively decided that certain things are unethical. So things like clearly, stealing things or murdering people. We've decided that that's against what we want to value as a society, and so we've codified those ethical ideas or values into law. So now it's against the law to steal things. It's against the law to murder, and a variety of other things. So, those ethical values have been codified as law. I mean, to the point where we don't even think them as ethical issues. We think them as legal issues, and they are. So there's a lot of overlap with that in that regard, at least in terms of what we as a society value as ethical issues. There's a lot of overlap between that and our legal framework or legal structure throughout history. That's developed throughout history. So that's the first component. The other component I think about with respect to ethical issues is the piece that we'll be getting into over the next couple of weeks, and that's more of the individual ethical issues. So, each of us individually, we come up in different environments. We have our own way of thinking, our own set of values. Some of those are very, very common values that we all share. but some are not. And so, each of us is obviously free to think what is or what isn't ethical. And, uh, those are based on a variety of factors. We all believe differently. We all have different, potentially different faith and religious values, all of which, and we've been taught different things by those that raised us. And so all of those are contributing factors to, how we think about ethics and what is ethical and what is not ethical. In terms of, and how to apply that into the healthcare setting. Things. What are some ethical issues that are making headlines? Right, the big one right now is abortion, right to privacy or not, or whatever. I wouldn't advocate one way or the other. I'm just bringing this up for us to think about healthcare as a right or entitlement. Just we'll be seeing more of that as we get closer to the presidential election cycle. How are we going to fix healthcare? Does healthcare need to be fixed? Why are we spending so much on healthcare, and how do we stop that? How do we make sure that everyone has access to healthcare without it being an economical nightmare? And how do we curb economic or healthcare spending? So a lot of those questions feed into the overarching question whether or not everyone has a right to access healthcare, whether or not it's an entitlement or not, and so those are important ethical issues in the healthcare setting. I mean, go back to that question that we had at the beginning of the class on ration. It's essentially a question about rationing healthcare, which is really a relevant ethical topic. Especially if you look at healthcare models in other countries, with socialized medicine, this concept of Medicare for all in America that's being thrown around. It has been thrown around for about a decade, which is sort of currently sort of the model in some of these other countries like England and Canada, where you have socialized medicine. Those that are against that typically cite this argument about rationing of healthcare, and that's essentially what it leads to. And so that brings you back to that question that we had at the beginning of the class. I mean, if you have 1,000 people and you have 400, 500 flu vaccines, then you have a limited supply. And so how do you ration that? I mean, how do you determine who gets the flu vaccines and who doesn't? How do you determine if you have a certain limited number of dollars to spend on healthcare as a government, and you have someone who's 85 years old who needs a hip replaced or some other major surgical procedure or knee replaced? It's very expensive. How do you ration that? I mean, do you just say no to that person? You know what I mean? I mean, those are, many of you are familiar with these arguments, and so those are the ethical questions and policy questions, healthcare policy questions that kind of feed into this whole ethical debate. An interesting one is that we'll be, I guess there are two. One major one that we'll be talking about, and it's part of one of our discussion questions, is this whole concept of euthanasia, or these laws that are starting to pass called death. It was a Death with Dignity, the Death with Dignity Act. Oregon was one of the first states to pass a death with dignity law. And there are several other states that have passed laws since then, essentially allowing terminally ill patients to receive a prescription of lethal medications that they basically administer themselves, and after completing this fairly robust consent process. And so as of January this year, you've got Oregon, like I said, Washington, Hawaii, California, and back in November of 2016, Colorado. It was on the ballot for a vote, and the state of Colorado passed it. I think it was 65% voted for it, and so now it's law in Colorado as well. Interestingly, I mean, those are all statutes in those states. In Montana, it's that there's been a death with dignity law, not by statute, but actually it was allowed by the Supreme Court in Montana in 2009. So it's been sort of this judicial law since for about 10 years in Montana. So anyways, I mean, as we get into ethical debates and ethical issues, debates is not even the right term because we're just having discussions and responding to questions. I think I mentioned this at the beginning of the class, but we're talking about some very sensitive topics, some topics that people likely feel very passionate about, and so it's really important to obviously be super respectful and recognize that not everyone, and I know, I have certain beliefs one way or the other, and I recognize that not everyone thinks the same way I do, and that's okay. I don't expect everyone to think the same way I do. You shouldn't expect to think that everyone thinks the same way you do, and so as we go back and forth on some of these ethical issues, it's important to be mindful of that. The only thing I want to talk about is just bring up this the reading in your material on clinical trials. Clinical trials. There's a huge, very complex drug development process in this country. It's very highly regulated by the FDA. The clinical trials is only one component of that. Not too, say 7-8 months ago, I conducted an investigation for a client that was because there were allegations by one of the former employees about the potential improprieties on the whole clinical trial process itself, largely with respect to the informed consent process. One thing to remember with respect to clinical trials is that informed consent is such a huge piece of that. And you work in healthcare, and you very well know that informed consent is very important in healthcare. It's even more important in the clinical trials process. And it all starts, the informed consent process starts with the advertising and marketing of the clinical trial itself. It's all part of the information that the potential subject receives, and the information, the process to which they are consenting. It all starts with advertising, and there's a lot of law guidelines, guidance to that respect. So there are FDA rules, ICH guidelines, IRB rules. Everything is essentially subject to the IRB approval in a clinical trial, and the IRB is like an independent review board that really oversees the entire clinical trial process. I'm gonna when I post this in the announcements, I'm gonna post a great website. It's on the FDA website, but it's a great page if you're ever interested in sort of just this high-level overview of the drug development process and just see what it takes to develop and market and sell a drug in this country. It's pretty fascinating, but I'll post that in the announcement, and you can take a look at that at your leisure. There are obviously serious ethical implications with respect to clinical research. All the laws and the guidance, because it's highly regulated because there's risk attached to it, and it's really designed. All those regulations are designed to protect the subjects of the clinical trial. It's like when I talk to clients about Medicare rules and regulations or Medicaid rules and regulations. Most of them, if not all of them, are designed to protect the Medicaid or Medicare beneficiary. And normally when either the state or federal agency, whichever one is applicable, are deciding, if they're deciding a case, they're going to interpret those regulations in favor of protecting that beneficiary or that patient. The same goes for clinical trials. And I mean, they're all designed to protect the patient. That's why informed consent is so huge. So a subject knows exactly what they're getting into. It is actually informed consent. And so there's a lot of emphasis, obviously, in a lot of the rules and regulations are designed to make sure that that happens and that they're properly protected. So anyways, that's sort of the introduction to the next couple of weeks as we dive into the ethics issues. Again, if you have any questions, want to talk through anything, particularly the whole concept of the methodology of analysis we've been discussing the last several weeks, please feel free to reach out. But if not, then have a great week and we'll talk to you later. Bye.